have three singers, I guess. I have a note that says the Civil War Singers will perform Saturday night at 8 p.m. and it's free at Fort Donaldson. I forgot who gave me that note, but Civil War Singers, if none of you have, some of you have not heard them, it's really neat. They can sing the old Civil War.
I hear Evelynda's going to do Amazing Grace on her harmonica. Back here, parents back here next to you.
Brenda's at Fort Donaldson Park or Fort Donaldson Church?
Park.
Okay.
Okay, and we do have two new members. We have here tonight Susie Shelby.
She's already left.
I saw her just a minute ago. Anyway, she missed that part, didn't she?
Brenda, if it's Susie, she's afraid to drive out there.
Is that what it is? Okay. Well, anyway, she did join our society tonight. And we have Kenneth Bird from Indianapolis, Indiana. And here comes Evelynda. There's still food on there. Put your drink. She's one of our new members too, Evelynda is. And when they have more people here, they have to Bible study in the churches. Choir practice at one of the other churches and things like that. So it's nice. So some don't get to come. But anyway, I'm glad everybody's here that is here. Teresa, it is now your turn. Speak now.
I met Mr. Turner in 2006, but I don't think I made a very good impression because the next time I met him, he didn't remember me.
See now.
He's been teaching longer than I've been alive, a total of 45 years. He started with Christian County High School, moved on to college. He loves Austin P. That is his favorite place to be, but he decided to teach at Hopkinsville Community College. And he said that he knew it was his last day, that he was ready to retire when a female walked in wearing a bikini top and overalls to the classroom, and he decided that it was time to throw in the towel. And though he lives in Christian County and loves Christian County, he has ties to Stewart County through relatives who were Bogart, last name was Bogart, who were around this area in 1806, and then moved on into Trigg County. His great-grandfather was captured here at Fort Donaldson and then sent on to Camp Morton, so there's another connection there. And another relative of his, Joe Ferguson, was the manager at the Bear Springs terminus in the early 1900s. So even though he resides in Hopkinsville and he is the historian there and very much involved with the Penny World Area History Museum and the Historical Society there, he does have ties to Stewart County. So we just need to give him a big welcome.
Thank God for air conditioning.
Amen. Oh, hallelujah.
Having helped just restore a Model T Ford Roadster or runabout, I like Model Ts, but I do believe that air conditioning is the best thing that's ever been done in life. Levine and I appreciate the invitation to be here. I know of at least one individual in this room that I place in the same category with your speaker because she is a character. And when I call you a character, it is with affection, with appreciation for your talent, and your ability to make it up as you go. I learned that a long time ago in teaching high school students and college freshmen. And I'm real proud of my Stewart County connections. But you didn't come here tonight to hear all about that. I'm especially glad to see some young folks here. We're all young at heart.
Amen.
But some young folks chronologically. to talk about a story that has been told and retold through the flatlands and the hills and the hollers of Tennessee and Kentucky since it happened. And I'm fully aware of the fact, from what I've been told, that the bells of Stewart County don't claim the bells of Robertson County. If I'm wrong about that, let me know. And I will hasten to add on the subject of the Bell Witch or anything else I know a little bit about, I am no authority, but a student to learn. And just because I say it, excuse the grammar, ain't no sure sign it's so. Because everybody has their own interpretations of what they have heard, what they read, and what they think they know. In fact, I've been relating this story of the Bell Witch for about 40 years plus. That's the White House call it. And one night, my wife and I were going home from a presentation. And I said, you know, honey, I believe I better look over those books we have on the Bell Witch again, because I'm varying so far away from the story. I believe we're getting away from the truth. There is no guaranteed, absolute, single column of truth about the Bell Witch story. It's an example of folklore which is believed sincerely in the minds of those who've heard Pappy and Mammy and Grandmammy and Grandpappy talk about it and believe it's so. And if you choose that, go right ahead. But in this fellow's judgment, the good Lord who made us determined it wise for us not to know everything. And that's one reason why he gave us a sense of humor.
Amen, brother.
Relating of this Bell Witch story got started on this fellow's part in relating it to high school juniors. Yes, back in the 60s, before you were even thought of. And the discovery was made that here was an example of history in our immediate part of the country that young folks had heard about, wanted to know more about, and he kept them awake. And of course, relating that story, being the prankster that this fellow is, we've had some real funny things happen. I'll tell you one story, and then we'll get on with the Bell Witch story. You know, in every group, there's at least one who is very gullible. And I'm looking over the crowd right now, just trying to decide which one it's going to be. And there was once a student teacher with us, and he asked if he couldn't be a part of the storytelling, and I said, yes, you got a cat. I like cats better. You bring that cat to class. And there was a window in the door. He was in the hall with the cat, and we had worked out the sign language for me to let him know, well, that's the governor's office. Or the State Historical Society. I was going to let him know when the time was right for him to open the door and let the cat come in. And so I gave him the sign, and he opened the door. The entire class was glued on the storytelling. It was a cloudy day and raining, and the lights were out. So the atmosphere was pretty good. The cat came into the room, looking over the students that didn't notice the cat. And it made a left-hand directional turn signal and started down the center aisle of the classroom. Heading right toward the most gullible, everything okay?
Turned it off.
Headed toward the most gullible female in the class. Seizing the moment, the storyteller sidetracked and said to the class, what in the world would you think if all of a sudden you would experience the sensation of something rubbing against your leg? And about that time, that cat brushed against her leg. She pole vaulted into the air, cursed the teacher. And I'm not sure but may have suffered some kidney problem. Now, it didn't take many moments like that for the reputation to get around. You don't need a radio or a television or a news greasy enough and tell it. How many of you have lived on an 8-party telephone line? The rest of them are culturally deprived. They've missed a whole lot. So, here we go with the story. It was the early part of the 19th century, as Teresa personally remembers it, that our part of the country was caught up in a great wave of migration from the East Coast. That was certainly true here in Stewart County, with your ancestors and mine. And among the people who came was a family with the name of Bell. John, his wife Lucy Williams Bell, and their 2 children. It was obvious they didn't know about birth control. And they came out of the Yadkin Valley of North Carolina, not too far from Winston-Salem, and settled on a farm bordering the Red River in Robertson County. Well, they built a big log house, just like those built here in Stewart. Double logs, breezeway through the middle, stone chimneys on each end to chase away the winter's chills. Maybe an L added to the back, and there they settled down to living. Now, as the years rolled by, the Bells developed a very enviable reputation in Robertson County. First of all, they were Baptists. I'm sure if I were to take a poll, the vast majority of here would be Baptists. The back row is full of 71. And so, the family branched out as the years rolled by, and the children built cabins in the surrounding neighborhood. And so, at the time our family trouble, as they called it, had its beginning. It came on a cold winter night in 1817. I remember it vividly. This is the story generally that's related by the longtime editor of the Clarksville Chronicle, Martin Van Buren Ingram. Some of you have reprints of his 1890-plus book on the true and authentic story of Kate Bell Witch. And so the family settled into living, as I mentioned, active in the Baptist church, good, honorable, hard-working, God-fearing people. No reason for anything of this unusual proportion to come to them. Well, you and I have had experiences we didn't think we deserved either, but we took them, made the best of them, and moved on. My wife knows because she's married to me. And so, on this winter night in 1817, remaining at home was the father, John Bell, his wife Lucy, and 3 of their 10 children, the youngest in the family, including teenage daughter Betsy and 2 of her teenage brothers. I mentioned for the benefit of our young people, who most of them hadn't heard of this, that at night it was the custom in frontier America, as Tennessee and Kentucky were in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, for the family to sit around and talk about what they'd been doing that day. Remember, the Chronicle was published monthly, maybe on up weekly. They had no modern conveniences to keep aware of what was going on. Papa went to the neighborhood store near what would become Adams Station on the Louisville National Railroad. The hobos called it the Long and the Nasty. And he would come home with the news that he had heard to tell to his wife. In those days, parents didn't tell children everything. And so they talked about what was going on for the day, and Pa read from the family Bible, and he led them in prayer, and they all went to bed. Now, Ma and Pa slept in a feather bed. Some of you know about that. In the only room in the house in which they had a fire, because they could live with that open fire as well. Benjamin Franklin was certainly right when he said, "He who warms himself with wood is warmed twice.
There you go.
Once when he cuts it, and once when he sits by and tries to stream it."
Do that.
And so then Pa read from the family Bible, and his wife went to bed in the feather bed in that room downstairs. The teenage daughter, Betsy, went to bed in a feather bed upstairs in the room directly over Ma and Pa's room. The teenage boy slept upstairs across the hall. I've described for you the living arrangement of the early settlers of Stewart County, as well as Robertson and Montgomery and Christian and all around. Now, our family trouble, as they call it, had its beginning in the boys' room. And I tell you, young fellas, you better be glad the lights are on. And we probably need to generate in our mind the route to the bathroom, because we might need it. The boys are lying in this feather bed with the givers, as they call the covers, pulled right up under their chins to chase away the winter's chills. When the boys hear something, not an unusual sound at all, they pass it off as the moaning of the wind around the corner of the house. And at times it's so soft, and at other times, without any warning, it becomes very loud. You never know from 1 minute to the next what's going to happen. Okay? Maybe I better get a little closer. So the boys lay there for a moment, just puzzled by the sound, and finally, summoning up their courage, they threw back the covers, stepped out on that cold plank floor. Some of you know what it was like to step out on a cold floor, or linoleum floor, even colder. And they went to the window and raised the sash to look outside, and as they did, to their shocked amazement, to their shocked amazement, there was no wind blowing at all. The night was deathly still. And worse than that, since they thought they'd heard the limbs of nearby trees scraping against the logs on the outside of the house, there were no limbs nearby to scrape them. Well, the boys went back to bed. This time they pulled the covers up just a little bit higher because they're getting scared. You know, when you're scared, you're a little more afraid than when you're scared. And then the cover on top of these boys, without any forewarning of what was going to happen, was yanked off on the floor. Now there's no heat in the room, and the boy on the side of the bed where the covers had fallen to the floor leaned down to pick them up to pull them back up on the bed. And how did he do that? Very carefully. And as he began pulling the covers back up on the bed, all of a sudden he felt a pulling or a tugging sensation at the other end of the covers. Now it's not likely you and I are going to sleep under much cover tonight. But the first cold night that comes, you remember tonight. And those covers on top of you, in case you notice a slight movement of them without you moving them. Don't call your speaker. Well, the next thing you know, Mr. Ingram tells us that the boys realized that there was something falling down the chimney in their room, no fire in that fireplace, and objects were rolling out across the floor. And the boys bolted upright and looked out on the floor, and with the light of the moon, that same one we may see tonight, revealed fresh fruit direct from Walmart rolling out. They got up and examined the fruit and found it fresh, but a little hesitant to try it. But back to the bed they went, and one perchance said to the other, "I wonder if anything unusual is happening to Sis, their sister, across the hall." Well, they didn't have to wait long to find out about their sister. Remember, this is happening. How far is it from here to Adams as a crow flies? 25, 30 miles?
42, 43 miles.
All right, now I'm talking about something, young folks, that happened. Really did. Not more than 40 miles from the spot you're keeping warm right now. Nearly 200 years ago. And so the boys were lying there in bed wondering about their sister. From the direction of her room, without any warning, came this blood-curdling yell. Out of bed, the boys bounded and across the hall into Betsy's room to see what was going on. As they got into her room, the light of the moon, that same moon you see on one of them, shining through the window, revealed her sitting upright in bed, her head in a tremble, a terrible convulsion. And as they got to her bedside, they found clumps of her hair. You better be glad you're that far away. That had been pulled out of her scalp and were lying on the pillow behind her. Now, ain't that weird? Well, she just suffered this awful pain. And there was the hair to prove something. Some force had pulled the hair out of her back. Well, but now Mom and Pa were upstairs to see what in the world their young folks were up to, and they were just as puzzled as the children were. And imagining the typical nature of parents that console their teenagers and urge them to go back to bed and go to sleep. Reckon they did. I wage with you one, I hope, just for good measure. The next morning, Pa and the boys went to the lot to feed the stock, while Mama and Sis were fixing breakfast. I always get so amused at people talking about making breakfast. I never ate any made breakfast in my life. Did you? It's fixed. Is that what you said? And so Pa and the boys are walking up the road corn stubble where they picked corn by hand on the way to the lot to feed, and they weren't poking along because it was cold. Pa was ahead of the boys. He raised a foot to take a step, as normal as anyone would take a step, when an invisible force, I'm aware of that glass of water.
You look thirsty.
Had a lot of things happen, but never that. Well, Pa raised his foot to take a step, and an invisible force yanked the boot off of that suspended foot, cast it some distance up the corner. As Pa stepped forward hurriedly to get the boot and put it back on, because it's bitterly cold. Reaching over to pick up the boot, he is seized in the mouth by an awful pain that takes him to the ground. Some of you may have to help this old fellow. The boys rushed to his side and turned him around and looked at him in the face. Ooh, what a face. His eyes were big and rolling. It was obvious he was not conscious of their presence. His mouth was hanging open, tongue was swelling. And the boys lifted Pa and half walked him, half drug him back to the house. His wife Lucy met them at the door, took one look at her husband, saw he was powerful sick. And the boy stretched Pa out on the bed. For the better part of an hour, he lay there like the proverbial light out. And then gradually he began to come to. And the family rushed him with questions, wanting to know what in the world he had experienced. And he said, well, when I leaned down to pick up the boot, I had this terrible pain in the mouth, as has been mentioned. And he described it as one possibly experienced when getting a stick hung crossways in the mouth. You know how excruciating that would be. Well, as the family sat around the fire that night, they really had something to talk about. Can you imagine how Andy Griffith would handle that? Especially with Gomer. And so the boys called upon Pa to let the spirit alone when Pa said, you know, a spirit has come since. Now here's an angle of history, folks, that you and I don't talk much about in Stewart County, at home in Christian County, and that is delving into the spiritual world, which you and I know that our ancestors of adult age experimented with. You've heard old timers talking about causing a table or a chair to levitate, and then others would say, shut your mouth, don't talk about that. It's that old Protestant indoctrination in us, you know, that if you can't explain it, you turn your head from it. You don't face it head on. And so the children pled with Pa, let this spirit alone. Betsy especially, she's going to need a wig. Well, several nights after that, these strange experiences continued, especially the moaning of the wind around the house. But remember, as this story is unfolding, nothing unusual is happening to Lucy, John's wife. Because we will see as the story unfolds that the torment was unleashed upon Papa, John, and teenage daughter, Betsy. Finally, after repeated efforts to get the spirit to appear, efforts on John Bell's part, it did! I tell you full blood, Daddy. I knew some of you would do it. A solid black cat. Now, it was a normal-looking cat, head on one end, tail on the other end, 2 legs, 4 legs, 2 ears, 4 legs, 1 tail. But there, its normal appearance ceased. Because when they looked at it in the face, it had eyes of human expression. but she. And the family gave her the name Kate. You know, every cat has to have a name. We have a granddaughter named Katie, but I call her Kate. I think it's very appropriate. She's just, what, 4 years old? But of all the grandchildren, she knows how to work grandpa. Some of you are grandpas who fall victim to that. And so, this newfound visitor, they named Kate, walked over to old John Bell, looked up at him in the face and said, "You devil, I've come to kill you." That didn't bother John Bell. How many of you had a cat tell you it was going to kill you? And then as the story continues, the spirit, Kate, walked over and looked at Betsy and in a very unkind voice said, "They tell me you're in love with the school teacher in this neighborhood," and had the nerve to name him. Now I know gossip swarms around Dover and Stewart County, because it does in my part of the country. But sometimes you're kind of slow about naming names, aren't you? A little while, maybe about that long. And the spirit says to him, "You're in love with Josh Gardner, the school teacher." Well, John Bell says to the family after her revelation of all of this, "You must keep it all quiet. Do not reveal to anybody in this neighborhood about what's going on." I usually say up in Hoptown that if you're allowed to start talking in all of these strange angles of riddles, that there is a mental institution nearby at Hoptown to which you might be taken. So the family kept it quiet. But what about Josh Gardner, the young school teacher who was courting Betsy? And he would come on Sunday afternoons, or maybe on Saturday night, and they would sit in front of the fire. Now listen to this, young folks. Courting in those days consisted of the fellow calling on the girl at her parents' home and sitting there and talking to her in the presence of her parents and all the rest of the children. That's what they tell me is the source of how Sweet Nothings got started. Just heavy breathing. Well, one night Josh was there courting Betsy and this black cat appeared and began to talk to him. And I'm going to tell you something just a little bit more than that school teacher could stand. So he said, "Feets, do your thing." And he left out. And you know what he did? All school teachers are black mouths. That's how we make our living, talking. And he went out and told everybody he saw. Well, that was the biggest news since Saturday Night Live. And people in droves came to the Bells to see this thing, to be entertained by it. The Bells were hospitable people. They invited everyone in who came, but they urged them, don't come out of idle curiosity, but try to help us get rid of this spirit. Because by now, John Bell is suffering the loss of consciousness, followed by about an hour of total weakness that just leaves him wiped out every few days. When Josh Gardner comes to court Betsy, they might be sitting in front of the fire when on one occasion an invisible hand slapped her across the cheek into the middle of next week. One day Betsy got up to go across the room to do something and fell sprawling on the floor. Josh quickly helped her get up and asked her what was wrong. She responded, "I fell over a stick of firewood," and there was none there. Now, Betsy's brothers were not exempt either. Come spring, they were plowing, and they happened to plow into an Indian grave. And out of fascination, as we would do today, they exhumed the skull and brought it to the house for the rest of the family to see. And that night after supper, while examining the skull, the family were, Kate appeared and put on the biggest rage of a fit you ever saw about the fact that they had robbed that grave. They desecrated that grave, took that skull back to where they found it, put it there and let it alone, which they did, I'm sure, by the next morning. Now, as the word swept all over Robertson County, the county line was no limit to the spread of that knowledge. some 30 miles from Adams, there lived a man at a farm he called the Hermitage. The year is about 1818 or 1819. And our beloved president-to-be, Mr. Jackson, was at that time, if my information is correct, the head of the Tennessee militia. And it was his responsibility to go examine this situation, to prove or disprove the truth of it. And are the Bells just a bunch of nuts, as we'd say today. So Jackson went. You can read the account of it. He was in a cart. And as the cart bearing the future president was within sight of the front gate of the Bell farm, those cart wheels suddenly locked as tightly as though they'd been set in concrete. The future president stepped from the cart onto the ground when this black cat appeared from the bushes beside the road and began to curse him severely for not believing her. For here's a part of the story that has been left out. Kate was a most versatile, most unusual cat. She could quote scripture, she could sing, she could preach, she could probably give the president some advice on how to plug up the hole.
Bring her on.
He would probably agree with that. And so, this cat gave Jackson the cussing of his life. I always like to say cussing better than cursing. That somehow just gets down to the hard core of it. And so in a moment, the cartwheels were loosed and Jackson went on to home. He met the Bells. Kate appeared. It was very nice in conversation. But as the shank of the evening came on, now boys, that's just the last vestiges of light are available. Jackson decided that twarn't no place for him to be after dark. Would you agree? And so he saddled up and went home. And some accounts say, recorded this experience with Kate. I don't know. Now, she didn't always confine her presence there at the house. She would go out on the road at night and scare people. One spring day, Kate and Josh Gardner were going for a walk along the bank of the Red River. And hand in hand, they were going along as they walked, and they got to a mud hole. The logs were rooted out. Well, they naturally parted company to walk around that mud hole, and when they did, this black cat appeared between Josh's feet, calling him just headlong, falling in that mud hole, and leaving him in no condition to continue the walk. The part I love about it was her visit to the Baptist church. Now, you correct me if I'm wrong, but to our knowledge, the oldest Baptist church in this 4 or 5 county radius is Red River at Adams, about 1790, somewhere along there. And we were very disappointed when they published the minutes, the early minutes of Red River Church. There is not one reference in the church minutes to the Spirit. Don't you find that kind of unusual? At least that I can find. Well, one Sunday morning, when the whole neighborhood was agog with conversation about it, people gathered in church, the preacher was behind the the pulpit, about ready to start his sermon, when the door latch rattled. And the latch was shaped much like this, but as you know, it would slide for the door to open and close. And as the door latch rattled, everybody in church did the same thing you do every Sunday morning when somebody's coming in late. You turn to look to see who it is and what they're wearing. Now you deny that. They all looked, and there was Keith. The congregation sat motionless as the cat walked up the center aisle, hopped up on the front split log bench. Not squirming too much, you might get a splinter. Everybody sat reverently as the preacher preached, as the story went. That afternoon, after church was over, the neighbors gathered in the yard of the Bell home, as was the custom on summer days, hopefully to be entertained by the Spirit. And that particular Sunday afternoon, Kate appeared. She looked over the crowd. By her gallant pole, she determined that far too many of them in that crowd had not been there that morning. And they missed a good sermon. She had heard it, so she preached it for them. Always wanted to, but never quite had the nerve to slip a cat in our church on Sunday. And see what would happen. The weeks rolled into months and the months into years. This trouble is going on now for upwards of 3 years. Was there a tiny settlement at Dover in 1820? Maybe a few. Not many. Do you think the people at Dover in 1820 heard about the Bell Witch? Absolutely. No question in the world. Talked about it. Who knows, some may have even traveled as far as Adams to see if they could see something unusual. Betsy and Josh eventually broke up because of the punishment that was rendered to Betsy when Josh was present. Generally. But you know, they couldn't stay apart, so they got back together. Kate came back in her fury. And finally, Betsy and Josh broke up. Betsy would eventually move to Mississippi and marry and leave offspring down there. Joshua Gardner would eventually marry, and there are a number of Gardner descendants in the General Adams neighborhood today. But I have on good authority, having told the story at Adams now, you think it was difficult to tell the story from there. But they assured me that to this good night, there's never been a marriage between a Bell and a Gardner. You know how families intermarry. Gracious me, it's wonder we have that sense. But you deny it when you trace your ancestry in Stewart County. So there's never been a marriage between a Bell and a Gardner that take it seriously. Poor old John Bell, well, he grows weaker and weaker. By the approach of Christmas time in 1820, John Bell is 70 years old. The average lifespan of a man in this part of the country at that time was 37. So, gentlemen, most of us have been gone a long time, don't have sense enough to know it. John Bell was stricken with seizure after seizure that left him weaker and weaker. And just before Christmas in 1820, from several versions of the story, Kate appeared and poisoned him, and he died. The neighbors and the family gathered for the funeral. Kate appeared at the funeral and put on quite a sight. You want to know more about it? Read what Ingram said. Not very nice to talk about. That night, as the family gathered back home, probably some friends and neighbors were with them, Kate appeared. She told them that her work had been accomplished. She had broken up the love affair of Betsy and Josh, and she killed that little devil John Bell. And she didn't bother them again. Well, she stayed around for a few weeks, and some say she told Betsy and Lucy, the widow, always kindly treated, that she would be back in 10 years. 10 years later brings us to 1830. Who's living at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in 1830? No less than our beloved old Hickory. Do you think word traveled all the way to Washington City that Kate had returned? Why, sure it did. Absolutely. And we didn't have telephone and telegraph yet. Almost telegraph, but not yet. There's a lady in this crowd that likes cold water.
Brother Gray says, telegraph, telephone, telewoman.
She never came back, as far as we know. There have been stories of strange things that have happened, and to the observer, they happened. And it is not our place to speak negatively. Some of you may have vaguely heard of an incident up in our county back in 1955, and most of you were living in 1955, when a spaceship from Mars landed at Kelly. And any UFO book you pick up is going to have a chapter on the little green men of Kelly. saw that were convinced it was real. And who are we to dispute it? Might happen to us one of these days. And so the story moved into the annals of our folklore. Remember, you have the two primary ingredients for a story of folklore, be it Stewart County, Robertson, or wherever. Love and tragedy. And just stop and think for a minute. Back in the days of Captain Jack Henson and long before, the people in this county were sitting out on a porch on a hot June night like this, fanning for all they were worth, with somebody improvising a story. And then somebody else picked it up and added a little bit more. And then a little bit more. Ain't nothing wrong with it. It's a part of our entertainment before the idiot box came on.
Hallelujah.
It's a part of our culture. Books have been written on the subject. Even a movie, so-called, if you saw it as I did, I was very disappointed because it didn't follow the story that you and I in this neighborhood attached to the Bell Witch. And I dare say that 100, even 500 years from now, when there's a Stewart County Historical Society, and there will be, they'll be talking about folklore. And it will inevitably include the story of the Bell Witch. So, tonight when you go to bed, if the air conditioner's turned up pretty stoutly and the room is a little bit chilly, and you pull up a sheet, place your senses in gear to see if you determine some twitching or pulling on the timbers. Because if you do, you be careful, it may be the Bell Witch, and she may be after you.
That was very entertaining. Thank you very much. Anybody got anything else we need to talk about before we adjourn and visit the old house? Coffee. I thought you was trying to get my attention.
I'd like for everyone to sign the book that's been going around.
Did everybody sign it? You can get over here. Anything else? All right, our next meeting will be July 27th. And we will have a pretty extensive business meeting probably that night.